Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of exponential technologies, business innovation, entrepreneurship, thought leadership, enterprise IT security, neuroscience, philosophy, personal development, and more. Welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show, everyone. This is Bill Murphy, your host of the Red Zone podcast. I'm thrilled to bring to you today Chip Conley. Chip is a New York Times bestselling author and hospitality maverick. Chip received the hospitality industry's highest honor, the Pioneer Award, and was named the most innovative CEO in the San Francisco Bay by the San Francisco Business Times. He has been a rebel entrepreneur. Chip disrupted the hospitality industry twice. First, starting at age 26, he transformed an inner city motel into a second largest boutique hotelier in the country and served as CEO for 24 years. Second, he's recruited by Airbnb as the head of global hospitality and strategy. And he was instrumental in working with the CEO and the leadership team in growing that brand, Airbnb, into the leading hospitality brand in the world, and still serves as a strategic advisor for them. And he's recently just written a book, actually a couple of years ago now, Wisdom at Work, The Making of a Modern Elder. And I just love this because he's taken his experience, and Chip believes that curiosity is the elixir of life. And with 5 published books, he's established himself as the leading authority at the intersection of psychology and business. And he's founded the Modern Elder Academy, which is the world's first midlife wisdom school. I find that so cool. It's so interesting. The first midlife wisdom school. I mean, if you're at 50, 40, 60 years old, you're literally halfway through your life. I mean, we're going to live a long, long time. And that's just what the science and what longevity is bringing now. And so what's your role? What's the role you're going to play in this fast-paced changing world? And some of the data is already in. And I talk a lot about innovation on this podcast, but how do we innovate biologically? Because we're not going to exponentially grow our brains at the speed of a chipset. But what we can do is there is measurable difference in having, it's not popular to talk about this, but age diversity. And it's really interesting. It's like if you put some older folks into your teams, you're not getting this effect of just like meism. I'm going to create culture. Chip talks about this quite a bit in the show. What's culture mean? Does culture mean a lot of people just like me? Or can we put in some older folks that are wise, that have a lot of experience? Well, the effect that creates is an exponential effect with teams where it's measurable now. And so this is a fun, wide-ranging conversation on how you can look at the aging workforce and how you can deploy that within your teams to create exponential effects. So with that, I want to welcome you to my conversation with Chip Conley, author of the book, Wisdom at Work, The Making of a Modern Elder. Thank you. All right, Chip, I want to welcome you to the show today.
Thank you, Bill. Good to be with you.
Oh, well, so I am really, really fascinated to talk to you because of your book that I've really enjoyed and got a chance to listen to you in a conference and a couple podcasts. And I think this role of the modern leader as the modern, what's the right word? Aging leader, the leader that's getting older.
Yeah, I call the person the modern elder.
The modern elder. And I just love that. And, I talk about this term of the next generation, the next gen CIO, the next generation CIO. And so definitely the younger crowd loves that word, but I think it's also partially doing it to kind of kick the older group into gear as well. And what's causing this need to talk about the modern elder? What was the genesis of that for you? Could you talk a little bit about that, Chip?
Yes. If you told me 10 years ago that I would be outing myself as a modern elder, I would have laughed because I said, no way. So I am a longtime boutique hotelier. I was one of the first boutique hoteliers in the U.S. and created the second largest boutique hotel company in the U.S. called Joie de Vivre, based in San Francisco. Ran that company as CEO from age 26 to age almost 50. sold the company. It's now part of Hyatt. So I ran it for 24 years. And then I wasn't really sure what was next for me. And I got tapped on the shoulder soon after that by the three founders of Airbnb because they had this little tech startup that they wanted to turn into a global hospitality giant. And nobody in the company had any hospitality or travel background, which is often the case. There's, as you know, there's disruptors in industries, and generally the people behind the disruption are young technologists or designers or big thinkers, but they don't really necessarily understand the industries they're disrupting. And so that was part of my role. It was meant to be a short-term, part-time job, turned into a now 7-year gig, 4 years in a full-time role, basically helping them steer the rocket ship and running. I was the head of global hospitality and strategy. And then for 7 years now, I've been the mentor to Brian, the CEO. What happened as I joined, I realized I'd never worked in a tech company before at age 52 when I joined 7 years ago. And what became clear to me quickly was they had hired me for my knowledge, but what they really needed was my wisdom. And that's something that Brian said to me after about 3 months on the job. And they started calling me the modern elder, who was as curious as he was wise. And what that meant was basically I needed to understand an industry I didn't understand, which was technology. And so I needed to be curious. If I was just using my own knowledge of the past, it wouldn't have solved my huge deficit in what I didn't know. But learning that industry helped me to apply my wisdom in ways that allowed me to be more effective in the organization. And so long story short is we live in an era where we're going to live longer. Power tends to be moving younger in digital industries, and the world is changing faster. And those three variables have a lot of people confused, and frankly, a lot of people in midlife feeling irrelevant.
As I was reading your book, getting ready for this, I'd heard you speak, but I thought, I love the book part because the book really gets into some of the stories. And I think my son came home recently. He's a junior in high school, and he goes to an all-boys school in Baltimore, and he knows my story. I worked with, basically, my father employed all of my friends growing up. He had a construction and development company, but he threw us all in the field, and we had to work with the tradesmen, basically. We had to work with the ditch diggers, the carpenters, the drywallers, all the folks that were putting the homes in the buildings together. And so you sort of got this, you knew nothing. I mean, other than how to sweep the room after it was done, you had to learn as an apprentice. And I think that, he came home the other day and he said, I've just met my friend of mine is a father as a plumber, and he needs help, and he's recruited a bunch of us. And I'm like, that's great, go do it. And I think this role of the apprentice and being able to, it's almost like that's skipped when we're in this technology. And I can't quite put my hands on it, but what are your thoughts on this kind of role of apprentice, apprentor? What's the person that is the elder that, what I don't know what that's called.
Well, I would say, here's a couple of thoughts on that. Number one is I think there are very few industries today in which the traditional role of power rests with older people, younger people learn from them, and that's sort of the only way that relationship works. Is there are very few industries today like that. Yes, the trades are a great example of that because generally speaking, as a tradesperson, if you're a plumber and you've been doing it or an electrician for 30 years, the process of becoming an electrician hasn't changed a lot. And yet, even in farming, which was certainly an apprentice industry where young farmers learned from older farmers, you had a farmer's almanac full of wisdom of older farmers, etc. Farming has changed a lot. So what I would say is that there are certain industries where it's still pretty traditional and the wisdom only flows in one direction from old to young. In most industries, in my opinion, the physics now moves in both directions. Wisdom moves from old to young on some subjects, but from young to old on other subjects. And so I think where we're going is an era of mutual mentorship as opposed to purely mentorship or apprenticeship of old to young. So let me use a couple examples. We were talking about Gary Vaynerchuk. I was on his show, and he runs a big digital marketing agency. And in the conversation with him, he was saying, what's interesting, Chip, is our industry is just dominated by young people today. The power in advertising and marketing is not people in their 50s. Generally, it's people in their 30s and maybe even in their 20s. But he said, what I really want to do is go out and hire some copywriters from the 70s and the 80s because they were so good at being able to concisely define a meme or something that actually get out into the world. And so, frankly, right after our show, he started advertising for copywriters in their 50s. And what he said in a follow-up phone call I had with him recently, he said, listen, that older person has a gem of wisdoms that they can pass on, including understanding humans better. Because one of the things that we get better at as we age is EQ, because we have pattern recognition about ourselves and others. Long story short is, I think if a copywriter from, in his or her 50s or 60s can go into an advertising agency that's got mostly people in their 20s and 30s and be curious enough to understand digital marketing today, but be wise enough to be able to offer the gems of the past around copywriting and understanding human needs, that person's going to do really well. Unfortunately, a lot of people in midlife and beyond instead resent the younger people because they are digital natives. And, you and I, Bill, when we grew up, the dominant technology that defined our lives was television, and it didn't do much for our careers.
All four channels.
Yeah, exactly. But the young people today, their dominant technology was computers and then the internet and then social media. And frankly, it poured Miracle-Gro on their career. Get over the sense of resentment. Instead, buy into the idea that you have as much to offer them as they do you. And frankly, 75% of millennials say they'd like a mentor, but only 2% have one.
Yeah, and they desperately need them. I need to come back to that one because that's a big one for me. In my company right now, my board, one of the women on my board brought up to me as she was departing the last board meeting in January. She said, you're not really utilizing some older folks that were on my team. And it stuck with me because she's like 61 and super dynamo. She was the CIO of Johnson & Johnson. Well, actually, she was the CIO of 100 CIOs at Johnson & Johnson. That's how big that company is. And she said, you really need to utilize. And I sat down with this person, and it was interesting. Just by paying more attention, there was this unbelievable exponential growth. And it was almost like, and you write about this unconscious bias. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because I think it was almost hit me like a 2x4 that I really, why didn't I pay more attention to this person? But I got so much growth from actually doing that. And so maybe you can comment to that a little bit.
Well, there's a couple ways to look at what's happening in the workplace today. And let's call it ageism, but I don't want to be politically correct about this, because my purpose here is not to say, older people are a protected class, although there is, EEOC rules around that in the United States. And frankly, it starts at age 40. At age 40, there's the risk of ageism. But, to prove ageism is really difficult. I think the key here is to recognize that there are a growing number of studies that show that the number one form of diversity in the workplace, especially on teams, if you want effectiveness, is age diversity. Whereas most companies get primarily focused on gender, race, sexual orientation diversity, all of which have shown positive results in terms of effect on teams. But the reason that age diversity is so valuable is because you have cognitive ways of thinking. Just your thinking processes are different. When you're younger, your brain is more focused. Your memory's better, your recall's faster. But you don't have holistic thinking. As you get older, you think more holistically. You think more systemically. You can connect the dots, which is why Brian at Airbnb made me the head of strategy of a tech company after being there for 2 months, because he says, I like the way your mind thinks. I was able to zoom up 30,000 feet and see the forest and not get caught up in the trees. And whereas a younger person's brain is much more focused. And therefore, having age diversity on teams is very valuable. And yet, only 8% of the companies in the world that have a diversity and inclusion program have expanded that D&I program to include age as just as important of a diversity as the traditional ones, which are gender, race, and sexual orientation. So long story short is this is valuable and effective for companies. But we have a natural tendency, especially for companies that are more digitally oriented, to think that the most important thing a company needs is DQ, digital intelligence. And it doesn't matter if you're a tech company. 7 of the 10 most valuable companies in the world today are tech companies. But all companies want to be tech companies. And therefore, there's a sense like we need to hire more digital natives. Maybe true. And there's, I'm not going to say that young people, millennials, Gen Z, even younger Gen Xers, are not phenomenally talented and aware of things that I'm not aware of. But the idea that somehow because someone's a brilliant technologist, it means they're a brilliant leader or have smart emotional intelligence or can think strategically or understand an industry well is a mistake. Because just because you're a brilliant technologist or understand the technological landscape doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be spectacular at those other things. And matching someone who's young with someone who's older means that they can learn from each other.
Yeah, I just love that. I think it's just a great way to tackle the apprentice model that we've used. I think we have really the digital revolution really hit in 95, 96 when the browser was invented. So really, it's not that long since we've sort of had just more ubiquitous access to technology. But prior to that, for hundreds and thousands of years, it was an apprentice model, and it was elders in a community. And it's interesting now how you're bringing this back, and I think it's quite necessary because I have younger folks in my company that are now leading the older generation, and I'm not sure that they really know how to most effectively do that. And you mentioned that in your book as well.
What's interesting, Bill, is the statistics on percentage of people who have an older boss is fascinating. A lot of us aren't aware of this, but about 40% of us in the United States today have a boss that's younger than us. And that's an interesting stat. But here's the part that's particularly interesting, is if you're 55, that stat is 69% of us have a boss that's younger.
Wow.
And by the year 2025, the majority of Americans will have a boss that's younger than them. Get that. Now put that through your brain for a moment. The average American by the year 2025, 5 years from now, will have a boss that's younger than them. In most cases, it'll be 2 to 5 years younger. But in many cases, it's 10 or 20 years younger. In my case at Airbnb, the person that I was mentoring, Brian Chesky, I've been a CEO for 24 years. Brian had been a CEO for about, 4 years when I joined him. So I was there to mentor him on leadership and hospitality, but he was also my boss, and he was 21 years younger than me. I'll never forget, Bill, this is a great story. I'll never forget the first time Brian had to do a review for me, like a personal performance review. And that was a few months into the job. And so here's the part that's interesting. So I'm his mentor, but he's also my boss. So he does a half-hour review. And so he said, so what do you think? And I said, do you want my opinion as your direct report, or do you want my opinion as your mentor about how you actually handle that? Because I didn't really know which role I was supposed to have. And of course, I gave him both, and he did a pretty good job. So the good news was I felt both seen as the direct report, and I also felt I felt proud of him of how he handled it. But the truth is, most people don't. Most people aren't so proud of their boss that's younger than them who's giving them a review. And frankly, the boss has never had any training in how to give a great review. So there's a lot here. And I think at some point I'm going to write a blog post. I have a blog called Wisdom Well. It's a daily blog. And I'm very much looking forward to writing a daily blog on the subject of what is it like to get your first review from someone the age of your son.
I love it. But it struck me as I heard you talking about it one time, and then it struck me within my own company. What about, we're talking generally people 40 and above, or are you thinking it's 45 and above, or it's really 50 and above?
It depends on the industry. So at Airbnb and in most tech companies, if there's an employee resource group, and an employee resource group is usually a group of people in a larger company that band together that have some connection to each other. In Airbnb, we had a veterans at Airbnb group, which is war veterans. There weren't many of them, but there were a few. It could be women at Airbnb. We had a group called Wisdom at Airbnb, which was people 40 and older, because only about 10% of the population at Airbnb at that time when it got started were people 40 and older. But in most companies, it might be 45 or 50. Now, let's look at it on both directions, though. The idea of age diversity is not just a way to sort of say, how are we valuing the elders in the workplace? It's actually quite the opposite in some companies. In a financial services industry, maybe healthcare, what you really want to do is focus on the millennials, because actually it's the young people who need a voice and that are sort of shut out of thinking and decision-making in a more traditional organization. So in sum, I think what we're talking about here is an intergenerational potluck. You have 5 generations in the workplace for the very first time. And yet sometimes those generations are speaking in different dialects, and they can learn from each other. And what we love about potlucks is everybody brings to the table what they do best. And I think a great company today realizes that that's how they succeed in the 21st century.
Yeah, it's quite interesting that when you take the political correctness out of it, which just really ires business owners quite a bit, the PC part of it, when you actually look at the math on just, I didn't do this based on the math, but I wanted this woman on my board because she was a freaking fantastic leader and I wanted her there, but I didn't realize afterwards that actually a woman on a board, your profitability goes to the roof based on the stats that they can do and track of public company. And it just makes so much logical sense with wise older generation in your teams. You made a point that the team performance, which we talk a lot about that, in innovation with the fast moving technology, we don't really talk about how we can scale human capabilities. We always talk about how we can scale the tech capacity, but we don't really talk about, okay, how can we get an amplified 10x result just from a team, not by working harder, but by what your point is, by the actual generational impact of a team.
Yeah, it's interesting. I call it invisible productivity. When you have a collection of people, the invisible productivity is what happens when you add someone to a team. It doesn't have to be just an older person, but just somebody who actually has the effect of helping people see their blind spots a little bit more appropriately. So there's a term in rowing, in crew called swing.
Okay.
So swing is when a group, let's say 8 people in a boat with a coxswain, and they're actually rowing, and they're so in unison that the swing happens to the boat, which means the boat starts to lift a little bit further out of the water because in unison they are able to go fast enough so it moves above the friction of the water that holds it back. In the context of an organizational team, swing means that you have a collection of people who are so in unison that they are able to move beyond friction. Now, generally speaking, I think the way we've historically thought about that is if you have a collection of people who are all unified and maybe all look the same and, demographically, that will lead to swing. But the other thing that people don't know is that often that will lead to groupthink. When you get a group of people together who are all aligned and all think alike, they don't see their blind spots. And whether that's a bunch of older people, younger people, men, women, whatever it is, they're less likely to actually have that dissonant voice. And the dissonant voice maybe messes up the swing a little bit initially, but once everybody gets on the same page and you have diversity in the group, you end up with a boat that has actually got less friction. And I got to say, I'm very proud that in the days of, whether it's at Joie de Vivre, when I ran that company for 24 years and we created 52 boutique hotels, or whether at Airbnb in my first 4 years there when I was, really helping a tiny company turn into a global hospitality giant, we had in both companies, very diverse collection of senior executives. But the key is to, I've used Pat Lencioni's book, The 5 Dysfunctions of Teams, as a way for us to help understand how do you take dissonant voices, allow them to actually have their point of view at the table, then get to alignment, and then everybody steps into alignment, and then you get everybody's rowing at the same time. And that's the thing, is people think somehow that, to align means that everybody's always agreeing. No, actually, the best teams have serious disagreement, major arguments, and then they finally get to a realization that they're on the same page, or there's an acceptance of what path they're going to take, and then everybody aligns. But they've had the opportunity to have the argument before that happens. Instead, what happens in many companies is there's a blind spot. Everybody aligns around something because they don't know other choices, or everybody aligns around what the senior executive, a CEO, decides, but then, on the sidelines, people are saying all kinds of bad things about that decision, and they're not aligned. So just know that, the thing that is beautiful about diversity is it actually frankly allows often all of your employees and your customers to be in the room as well. It's interesting at Airbnb, the average age was 26 when I joined at age 52, but our fastest growing demographic when I joined was people 45 and older, both as guests and hosts. Who was going to represent that person in the room if the average age in the room was 26?
That's fascinating. I think the word empathy is sort of maybe can be overused, but just even being able to think about the needs of that demographic, it's hard to do that. Hard to stretch that as a 26-year-old.
Well, you don't know what you don't know. It's not like when I was 26, I was much wiser than these 26-year-olds. The big difference was I didn't have as much power as a 26-year-old does today in a tech company sometimes.
Well, here's the thing, Chip. I think when we were 26, 46 was old. I actually feel faster, stronger, fitter now at 50 than a lot of 25-year-olds. It's funny. I'm like prepared for the next 50, which I think was a very different mentality in the 70s and 80s when you were in your 45, 55 years old. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, there's two thoughts there. Number one is it does suggest that longevity is going to play a role in the workplace, meaning more and more people. You probably, Bill, will work, who knows? You might work till you die. You might work till you're 75. Who knows? But, in the past, until about 20 years ago, there was a long-term trend toward the average retirement age declining, and yet people living longer. So in essence, people were in an era of retirement for 20 years. And what was interesting is a lot of studies showed that retirement was actually not good for your health, or not so much bad for your health, but bad for your mortality, in the sense that it actually accelerated mortality by 2 years. And it's partly because people lost a sense of purpose, community, and some kind of discipline in their life. So what's interesting is, yes, we're going to live longer when we're healthier longer. And yet power is moving younger. And this dynamic of we're going to live longer and be more active in the workplace longer, but power is moving younger, creates a really weird dynamic. It's almost like we expect these young digital leaders to miraculously embody the relationship wisdoms and leadership skills that we've had, decades to learn. And so what I think is interesting is companies that start to figure out how do you match, like a mutual mentorship match, a person in their 50s with a person in their 30s, and have a project. You have a task force in a company about, let's say there's a task force around coronavirus right now, around the idea of how are we going to respond to coronavirus as a company. Wouldn't it be interesting if you had two co-leaders, but one a boomer and one a millennial, that are actually leading that task force, and then maybe from different departments and all kinds of other diversity. But do know that actually allowing people to become partners on projects when they have 20 or 25 years separating them is probably a pretty smart thing to do. So yes, I agree that we are going to have 50 maybe the new 30 physically, but 30 is the new 50 when it comes to power in companies that are exceptionally digitally focused.
Yeah, and that's part of what's happening as well. Is like, as you mentioned earlier, most companies are becoming digital companies. Even if you're a construction company, you're becoming more digitized. And, it's interesting. You brought up coronavirus, and I think this is an interesting play for folks that, when you think about it, we've had 9/11, this reminiscent to me at least of complete and utter shutdown of the planet, or certainly in the United States in 9/11. I started my business in that year, built a home that year, and had my first child that year. So that was no fun. And I think you remember that in the hotel. Your company was midstream with hotels at that point, right?
We had 9/11 and the dot-com bust at the very same time, plus soon after that SARS. So yeah, it was a difficult time. Then we had the Great Recession, and now we have the coronavirus. The big difference and the worry I have right now with where the world is this is so sudden, so deep, and so confusing in terms of what's going to happen. And those other two we didn't have government-directed shutdowns. And we do have that right now. And so I have a huge worry for where the economy is going to go. I mean, it's pretty obvious that it's not going to be good. And I think that, it could lead to a reset in many ways. And sometimes resets are good. And, but I don't know. I mean, I get very much why we're requiring the shelter in place. And yet the thing that's not being calculated is what's the financial effect of all this. And from a public health perspective, do we have more suicides and more people in poverty and more, just economic or emotional strife and cancer and heart attacks and things like that because of what's happened here? And I'm not saying this to say that the public health authorities made the wrong call here, but I do think that if we'd been a little bit more prepared to say, so how long, it'd be nice to know how long the shelter in place is going to last. They've said a certain number of days, but how do you do business planning? As a hotelier, I'm in the travel industry. It's just like we're about to lose the summer window of when people plan their summer vacation, which is usually right after they go through a spring break. And you lose that, and then people won't travel. And even if shelter in place goes away, people might do a staycation closer to home. And what you do in doing that is you in essence devastate an industry that was not prepared for this. You prepare for a recession because the indications in terms of economic indicators in the overall population give you some canary in the coal mine. There was no canary in the coal mine here, although to some degree there was. There was basically, you could see what was happening in China. But I think the thing that this has proven is how connected the world is. And we either have to acknowledge that the world is disconnected and realize we have to come up with solutions as a world, or we have to sort of say we're going to take a more balkanized approach, which is, we're going to sort of just focus on our own country. But I think if that's the case, we are going to see an enormous shrinkage of the total addressable market for many companies if they exclusively are going to focus just on their own country in terms of where they produce and serve their products and services.
Yeah, I've done my part of trying to read, okay, let's just infect the whole population and just get this all done and over with and overwhelm the hospitals, and we're going to lose a certain set, but at least everybody's working and we've got the economy moving along. We haven't really accounted for the fact of losing the service industry and people that, businesses that really can't afford to miss payrolls and can't afford to not have people patroning them. Hotels, of course, a part of that, restaurants and such. So I think the interesting part of this is it's sort of the elders, thematically, the older generation has taken a couple hits. And we've seen, I think I did a quick webinar last week. I said, how do you want to be remembered as a leader after this is done? And, can we in our own little way organize the people around us such that there's someone here that there is going to be light at the end of the tunnel. That tunnel might be 2 weeks or it might be 2 months or a year, but ultimately the fundamentals of this economy were strong. There is a business-oriented leadership. We're going to get through this. I think for the younger generation who hasn't taken a couple hits since 2007-8, you've got to be sub 33, 32 years old, and they've never taken a hit across the face.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. I wholly agree. I'm a mentor to 5 CEOs, all of them millennials, and all of them generally in the travel or real estate space. And what's fascinating is, as leaders, they've never had to deal with a downturn. They may have, in the case of the Airbnb founders, they started Airbnb in 2008 at the start of the recession. In fact, Airbnb was an idea that, in fact, was fueled by the recession in some ways because people still wanted to travel, but they wanted to do it more affordably. And people wanted to host people in their homes because, frankly, they lost their jobs. And so it was sort of a little bit recession-proof. But Brian and Joe and Nate, the 3 founders, have never been through this and never been through a downturn. And this downturn is going to be more savage and severe than just about anything since World War II. And, Merkel in Germany said basically this is post-World War II. This is the most serious thing we've ever faced. And so, again, intergenerational collaboration on this would make a big difference because depending upon the nature of a downturn, this one's been sudden, which means you better get really smart about expense cutting quickly. And I am somebody who's I'm all about corporate culture. I believe that, how you handle a downturn like this says a lot about where the culture goes. But in one like this, with the Great Recession was similar to this in the sense that it happened pretty quickly in our industry, whereas the dot-com bust and 9/11 was very much over the course of time. 9/11 was sort of a sudden thing, but the dot-com bust in the Bay Area, which is where a lot of my hotels were, had a 4-year, just every year got worse than the year before. And so when things get worse than the year before, you can actually have a slower process of cutting costs. But when things happen quickly, you better act quickly because otherwise you may run out of cash pretty quickly. And so, that's the part it's tragic. And there's a guy who's a CEO of a company. He's been running it. He's 30 years old. He's been running it since he was 21. It's now a company that has a valuation just under $1 billion. But he has no idea he's very culture focused. So his point of view is, we'll wait this thing out. And it's like, no, you know what? I'm a culture focused guy too, but you absolutely have to go to, your wartime plan here. And you got to do it in a considerate and thoughtful way such that it doesn't scare people. But people need to know that you got to get thrifty and scrappy. And this is not the time to wait a month to see how things are going to play themselves out. I can tell you how they'll play themselves out. One thing that's true about us as we get older is we get better at recognizing patterns. And recognizing patterns is another way of saying wisdom. Wisdom is another way of talking about intuition. And your intuition gets stronger over time because you sort of see the pattern, and the pattern helps your intuition to sort of see the future. And this is, again, why cultivating and harvesting wisdom allows you to be able to see the future a little bit better, which is why that holistic synthetic thinking, the connecting the dots, can be exceptionally valuable. So part of my role right now is to be basically in triage with some of these companies saying, okay, let's look at how we're going to reduce the costs.
Yep. They're going to have to, they're going to have to be real step up to the plate type leaders for this. And there's going to be some collateral impact. One of the things I had a question about from you is so this pattern recognition that comes with the older brain. I just love that, and reading about it and you talking about it. When does that, there's a certain self-awareness though, when I was looking at the myths of the older worker, their resistance to change. So they've taken so many hits. So there's a good side to what we're talking about. They've taken a lot of hits so they can remain settled and calm and kind of a stable force through the change and not get as rattled. But then there's also that resistance factor that plays in where they're not as accepting, or they can't quite make the leap to the new idea because of the fact that they've gotten some more damage from the past. And what are your thoughts on that, and how can the older worker navigate that?
It's interesting. There's a study that was in the Harvard Business Review, Zenkman and I can't remember the other guy's name, but it was fascinating. It showed that women stay open to change more easily than men in the workplace, and especially in business. And it's partly because women's level of confidence grows with each passing decade of their life. They're more confident in their own skills and in learning in their 30s and their 20s, 40s, 30s, and 50s, 40s. Men start to top out in their mid-40s, and they start to shut down because they actually get used to the way the world works, and they're less open to new information. And it's actually what this study showed was it actually has a little bit to do with their level of confidence. And their level of confidence in the mid-40s and beyond starts to decline a little bit. This is the average man, let's say, just not everybody. Whereas the average woman's sense of confidence and growing openness to something new goes till late 50s. So it's interesting. So I think if I'm talking to you and me, as I'm a 59-year-old, you're a 50-year-old, the thing to say to us is be open to having a growth mindset. Carol Dweck is a psychologist from Stanford, showed that basically there's two kinds of mindsets in the world. There's the fixed mindset and the growth mindset. When you're in a fixed mindset, you tend to want to prove yourself and you define success as winning. And so as you get older, because you get a little more cautious, you actually shrink your sandbox of what you focus on, because you don't want to focus on things that you're going to not win at, because success is winning and you're proving yourself. When you have a growth mindset, you're not focused on proving yourself, you're focused on improving yourself. So the definition of success is not winning, it's learning. When you can make that change and move to learning as opposed to winning and being the dumbest person in the room, which I had to do at Airbnb on many occasions, and be open to learning and to be open to being curious and not trying to just focus on what you know you can do well. What that allows for is it both allows for you to learn something new, but it also opens yourself up such that people don't see you as the cranky, old guy who just sort of talks about how the world works based upon a model that's 5 years old. And this is where OK Boomer came along, this whole OK Boomer thing from millennials saying, OK Boomer, it came from a place of, those older people aren't open to learning and they're not open to listening. And, there's some truth to it. And there's also, it's like a sort of BS thing as well. But there's some truth to it in the sense that if you're just sort of someone who's caught in the past and you're just going to be preaching, you're going to be preaching to an empty church because all the young people are going to leave the church because they don't want to be preached to. Young people don't want a preacher or a parent in their work group. They want someone who's going to be a collaborator.
Yeah, that comes up quite frequently because I think, I've been in the tech world. My company's a security company, and most of the CIOs that are in my innovation collaboration group, I think there's a firm realization now that they're no longer the smartest person in the room. Like it used to be that you could walk in as a CIO and the business was seeing you as knowing everything. And really now the role of a modern technology leader is how can you actually lead? How can you pull the information from the troops in your organization up so that you can synthesize those data points to make a decision, but you cannot, it's too much complexity. And which is to your point, which I love, is they're losing their confidence, and that the role of a modern leader is not to be confident in yourself, but to be confident in your ability to collaborate the solution set together, which is a way of getting to a better solution because of the complexity involved.
Yeah. They say that wisdom is the perfect alchemy of confidence and doubt, which basically, Socrates long time ago, back in Greek times, really spoke about, about the idea of asking great questions. And where that came from was the idea that a question can help you to see something in a new way. And so having doubt and being open to having doubt, as opposed to sort of feeling like you always know it all, or you have to sort of portray yourself as the know-it-all, having that openness to doubt and openness to new information is valuable because it allows you to be in that constant learning growth mindset mode. And at a time like now, when we're facing something that we've never faced before, a global pandemic that is in a more connected society. We've had pandemics before globally. The Spanish flu 102 years ago was a global pandemic, but it didn't spread as quickly as this did because we didn't have supersonic planes that actually transported it, around the world as quickly as it did. The good news this time is we actually do have, medical technology that probably can solve this faster with less of a death toll as a percentage of the population, for sure, than we did 100 years ago. On the other hand, we're more connected. So the effect economically and globally is going to be more substantial and more quickly felt. And that's where we're at. That's the part that actually is new. The idea of addressing a pandemic is it's not a new thing, but the approach of how quickly it's spread is new. But what's new completely, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out, is how does the world economic situation address itself when things happen as quickly as they've happened.
Yeah, the digital, we all know we're connected digitally, and certainly, from a cybersecurity perspective, the national defense, we're concerned about things like nuclear power plants and critical infrastructure being taken down and really impacting huge chunks of the population. And certainly businesses are concerned about security of their organizations, but we never really thought about the biological impact of essentially a virus. It's very interesting to have a virus on the digital world where we're used to, and taking out sort of single instances. But now we have this essentially something that could taking out the entire world and the entire planet. And like you said, that World War II is probably the most appropriate equivalent to that as part of being a global impact.
Yeah, I think, God help us if computer virus comes along anytime that's serious in the next year, because what this is testing is our digital infrastructure to handle, whether it's Zoom calls or a variety of other things that are making us more reliant on how we connect with each other digitally. You're right. I mean, when we talked about the virus, we tended to talk about it, especially if it's in sort of some dark agent out there in the world or some other country doing something. It's been sort of a computer virus, and what's fascinating with this one is there's no evidence that any dark agent out there created this virus for the sake of destabilizing the world. But there's interesting. I was listening yesterday, and you have to be careful about who you listen to on the internet, because it's like true or false. But it was a doctor who's really well respected, and he was talking about 5G and okay, with all of these, what's the evidence that 5G actually, and the fact we have all these satellites in the air, and what's the electromagnetic effect on our bodies of going to 5G, and it was like, oh wow, what if that, because Wuhan was the number one place in the world for 5G connectivity. It's like, okay, well, that sounds terrible.
Yeah.
Did we bring this on ourselves based upon how we have not noticed the effect of technology and electromagnetic currents on our bodies? So who's to know? We have a lot to learn. And I think the part that's interesting, especially compared to, say, in 1918 when the Spanish flu pandemic happened, is I think there's probably more of a sense that somehow we think we're more advanced than we are. Who knows? We may look back on this 100 years from now, our next generations may look back and say, oh, look at how little they knew back in the year 2020 when that pandemic came along. So there's a natural tendency to think we are 90% of the way in terms of our knowledge about something, when in fact maybe we're only 20%.
I read in your book you're a fan of Joseph Campbell. Or have you read some of Joseph Campbell's?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, just from the journey here and kind of this hero's journey perspective of, what this is from a cultural perspective, and kind of as we wrap this up as a leader and as kind of a modern elder leader, what Joseph Campbell would say about this from his perspective. Have you thought about that at all?
Well, Joseph Campbell was interesting. He had the hero's journey, and hero's journey was based upon something really that came from a guy named Arnold van Gennep, who was a social anthropologist who studied rites of passage and initiation. So what he saw was there were basically three phases in it. Think of like boot camp in the military. You have the separation from the past, which is first phase. So you're actually separating from something. Then you go into this liminal transitional period, which is boot camp. And then on the other side of that, you come back into society in a new form, in a new way. George Lucas, his films were based upon Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, and that hero's journey followed that rites of passage. So I think that where we are here is we've entered the liminal stage. We've entered boot camp, and the question is, how long does this last? What are we supposed to learn, and how are we going to get on the other side of it? I'm a big believer in the caterpillar to butterfly journey, which is caterpillar bulks up on food, then spins its web and goes into the dark, gooey place of the second phase, which is the liminal transitional period, and then it comes out this beautiful butterfly. Let's hope, crossing our fingers, that that's what we have ahead for us in society. We are certainly in the dark, gooey period right now, and the question is, how quickly do we get out of this dark, gooey period to a place where this experience actually makes us stronger and, frankly, a little bit more connected in the world in ways that are actually positive. We'll see. At this point, I'm generally an optimist. My level of optimism has been declining over the past few weeks, but I do think there are some collateral benefits that are coming out of this, including how people are connecting with themselves, even with social distancing, how people are feeling a depth of connection to the people who are important in their life.
Yeah, sometimes you need the opposite to really appreciate where we've been and where we are. This is definitely an experience of the opposite of what we want. But there's no algorithm for experience. That's a quote that always sticks out for me now. There's no, as we know it, no matter how fast and changing this planet is, there's no machine learning AI algorithm for wisdom and experience. So as we wrap up, Chip, is there anything relative to my audience or in our conversation that you're hoping to convey, or that you're like, gosh, I wish Bill would have asked me that question. I would have gone down this path. Is there anything that you can think of?
I think the only one would be our midlife wisdom school in Baja, in Mexico, called the Modern Elder Academy. Maybe we just finish with that.
That'd be great. Yeah, I was going to ask that. So let's go there. Talk about the Modern Elder Academy.
Yeah. So my experience at Airbnb taught me, wow, there's a growing need, I think, for modern elders, so to speak, in young technology companies. It's just companies in general. So it got me to the place of saying, well, what if we created a midlife wisdom school, a place where people come, spend a week or two to actually repurpose their wisdom and what they've learned, and maybe even shift their mindset on aging. Because if you're going to live till 98, which a lot of us will, and you're 58, you're actually only halfway through your adult life. You've got 40 years of adulthood behind you and 40 years ahead of you. And yet most of us at age 58 think that we're just on the verge of retirement, or we're no longer wanting to try to learn something new. Long story short is we created this in early 2018. We've now had 800 people from 24 countries go through the program. So we have a very active alumni program. And what it's been able to show at the Modern Elder Academy, and it's a socioeconomically diverse place. We have scholarships and all kinds of things that allow all kinds of people, whether it's a steel worker. Last week we had a steel worker, a unionized steel worker who was here, a physical therapist, a nurse, and an elementary school teacher in a cohort of 18, along with a CEO of a tech company, along with a retired software engineer, along with a doctor who decided they didn't want to be a doctor anymore. And so it was a fascinating group of people. And so I think more than anything, what we need to realize is the three-stage life of you learn till you're 20 or 25, you earn till you're 65, and then you retire till you die. That model is probably in the process of going away, because you're going to have gap years, you're going to have sabbaticals, you're going to go back and retrain and learn something new in your 50s. And so we need more schools and tools for people in midlife to help them repurpose themselves. And that's what the Modern Elder Academy is.
And that's modernelderacademy.com?
That's right, modernelderacademy.com or .org.
And you're in Mexico, correct?
We're in Baja, California.
Oh, okay.
1 hour north of Cabo San Lucas, and beautiful beachfront campus, very safe, and nice and remote.
Oh, that's how would you get there? Did you get there through San Diego?
You fly through Los Cabos, so you can fly to the Cabo airport, and both all over New York flies through Cabo, Atlanta, Houston, Chicago, San Francisco, Seattle, LA. So there's a lot of ways to get here.
Great, and I will put that on the show notes page for all listeners to be able to check the Academy out, and also your book that I'm going to put on there as well, Wisdom at Work. And Chip, I want to thank you for spending your time with us today. This is fascinating conversation.
Bill, thank you. I appreciate what you're doing.
Okay, have a great day.
All right.
So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcast. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously, and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.